Some secrets are worth killing for, others are worth dying for. But when Silas Ward rode into the God-forsaken town of Willowbrook on that blistering August afternoon, he was about to discover a third kind. The kind of secret that could unravel a man's entire life, burn down an empire built over 23 years of sweat and blood, and still leave him with no choice at all. He saw her from the edge of the town square, standing on a makeshift auction platform, a woman in a faded blue dress. The kind of dress that clung to curves that time hadn't managed to erase, but had instead, somehow, perfected. Her hair, once a fiery auburn, was now streaked with silver that shimmered like captured moonlight under the brutal sun. It framed a face that had starred in every single one of his lonely, sweat-soaked dreams for more than 2 decades. Clara, Clara Whitmore. No, not anymore. Now she was Clara Bell, and she was standing there with her chin held high, a queen on a pauper's throne, even as the shimmer in her emerald eyes betrayed the tears she refused to let fall. But this wasn't just any auction. This wasn't for cattle or land or foreclosed property. You see, the item being sold was Clara herself, and the man orchestrating the whole sickening spectacle wasn't just any businessman. He was a ghost from Silas's past, a ghost with a scarred lip and a smile that promised that some debts are only ever paid in pain. His name was Nathaniel Cross, and he had been waiting 23 long years for this exact moment. What happens next is a story of love, betrayal, and a choice so impossible it will leave you breathless. If you're ready for a story that will keep you guessing until the final second, do us a quick favor and tap that like button. It helps us more than you know. Now let's get back to it. Silas swung his leg over his stallion, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a thud that felt like a drum beat for a hanging. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of his own making. He'd only come back to this dusty hellhole to settle his father's tiny forgotten estate. 3 days, he told himself. In and out, settle the papers, sell the land, and get back to his life. Back to the sprawling empire he'd built from nothing. Instead, he'd walked straight into a nightmare. He'd found the woman who had defined every sunrise and every sunset of his adult life, standing on a block, about to be sold like a piece of meat. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a booming voice, bellowed across the square. "What am I bid for this fine specimen, gentlemen? 38 years old, but look at her. Strong hands for work, you see, good hips for bearing sons, and a bosom still firm enough to warm a man's bed on a cold winter's night." A wave of heat, hotter than the afternoon sun, washed over Silas. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Clara's face was flushed a deep crimson, a stark contrast to her pale skin, but her spine was a rod of iron. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just stood there, absorbing the humiliation with a quiet dignity that ripped Silas's heart right out of his chest. It was the same dignity that had stolen his breath all those years ago when they were just kids dreaming of a future under a willow tree. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The way the worn fabric of her dress pulled taut across her chest with every shallow breath she took. The graceful, defiant curve of her neck as she scanned the leering faces in the crowd. Even now, broken and betrayed, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. $1! A voice shouted. It was Tobias Crow, a local drunk whose grin was a ruin of missing teeth. A few other pathetic bids followed. $2, $2.50. They were treating her like livestock, a prized mare past her prime. But Silas wasn't looking at them. His gaze was locked on the man standing just beside the platform, arms crossed over his chest, watching the whole disgusting theater with a look of cold, satisfied amusement. Nathaniel Cross. He'd aged, but the cruelty was still there, etched into his face. His once black hair was now salted with silver at the temples, and he wore an expensive suit that didn't belong in a dusty town like this. But his eyes were the same. Pale blue chips of ice, calculating, ruthless, and utterly without mercy. 23 years ago, Nathaniel Cross had been his best friend, his partner. Together they had scraped and saved and bought their first small herd of cattle. They were going to build an empire side by side. They had a dream, but their dreams were different. Silas dreamed of hard work and honest reward. Cross dreamed of power, and he didn't care how he got it. He was willing to steal, to threaten, to burn families out of their homes if they wouldn't sell their land. The breaking point came on a hot summer night, just like this one. It was the night Cross laid out his plan to drive the Whitmore family, Clara's family, off their property so they could snatch it up for pennies on the dollar. It was the night Silas finally said no. It was the last night they were ever partners. And it was the night before he was supposed to marry Clara Whitmore. "Going once for $3, the auctioneer shouted, his voice snapping Silas back to the present. Clara's gaze swept across the crowd one last time, a desperate, hunted look in her eyes. And then her eyes found his. For a split second, the world stopped. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her lips parted in a silent gasp. Her hand flew to her throat. The mask of composure she had worn so bravely shattered into a million pieces. He saw it all in that one fleeting glance, a flash of impossible hope, followed instantly, overwhelmingly, by raw, undiluted terror. She knew, somehow she knew this was a trap, and he had just walked right into it. $500. The words tore from Silas's throat, sharp and clean as a gunshot. Silence. Absolute dead silence fell over the town square. Every single head swiveled in his direction. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $500 was a fortune. It was more money than most of these people would see in a decade. Cross's head snapped up. His cold, calculating eyes met Silas's across the dusty expanse that separated them. And that old, familiar, predatory smile spread slowly across his scarred lips. "Well, well," Cross said, his voice a low, dangerous purr that still carried across the silent square. "Silas Ward, I was beginning to wonder when you'd make your grand entrance." Silas didn't say a word. He just swung down from his horse, his polished leather boots hitting the ground with a deliberate, heavy sound. He wasn't the scared boy who had fled this town 23 years ago. He was a man who had built a cattle empire from dust and grit. He had faced down rustlers, droughts, and financiers who would gut their own mothers for a profit. He knew how to command a room, or in this case, a town square. He wore a tailored black coat, a gold watch chain glinting in the sun. But it wasn't the clothes. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. A predator in his own right. The crowd instinctively parted for him as he walked toward the platform, a path clearing as if by magic. His eyes never left Cross. "The auctioneer called for bids," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet, but with an edge of steel that made the air crackle. "I'm bidding." He could feel Clara's eyes on him. Her chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He risked a glance at her. The worn fabric of her dress seemed to strain with every frantic beat of her heart. The sight of it, even now, stirred something deep and primal inside him. But her expression wasn't one of relief. He had expected to see hope, gratitude. Instead, what he saw in her emerald eyes was a desperate, silent warning. "Run, Silas. Run." "This is all very touching," Cross said, stepping forward with the fluid, deadly grace of a panther. "The prodigal son returns to save his long-lost love. How perfectly dramatic." He paused, letting the tension build. "But you really don't understand the situation, old friend." "Then enlighten me," Silas bit out. Cross's smile widened, showing a row of perfect white teeth. It was a wolf's smile. "Mrs. Bell's dearly departed husband, Samuel, owed me a considerable sum, not just in money, but in services rendered." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "When Samuel Bell decided he wanted to back out of our little arrangement," Cross continued with an eloquent, dismissive shrug, "well, accidents happen. It's a tragedy, really. Now his lovely widow is obligated to honor his debts." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Samuel Bell hadn't died in a gambling accident, as the town gossip claimed. He'd been murdered. And this whole story about a debt was a lie, a carefully constructed cage designed to trap Clara. "How much?" Silas asked, his voice flat and hard. He reached for the leather pouch on his belt. He had enough cash to buy this entire town twice over. Cross just laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Silas, you still think this is about money?" It's never been just about money. His pale blue eyes were boring into Silas, stripping him bare. You see, Samuel was helping me move certain merchandise through this territory, a very profitable enterprise. When he suddenly developed a conscience, it left me with a logistical problem. Cross started to circle the platform, slow and deliberate. His men, Silas now noticed, were quietly, strategically positioning themselves around the square. They weren't just ranch hands. They were gunslingers, hard men with cold eyes. I need someone who knows the local routes, Cross went on, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the price of feed. Someone who knows the sheriff's patrol patterns. Someone who knows which people ask too many questions and which people know how to keep their mouths shut. Someone like, say, the wife of my former courier. The full, horrifying reality of it crashed down on Silas. Clara's face had gone ashen. Her husband hadn't just been killed for trying to leave Cross's criminal operation. Cross was now forcing her to take his place. But that wasn't the worst part. And if Mrs. Bell proves uncooperative in that regard, Cross said, his gaze sliding over Clara's trembling form with a disgusting, proprietary air, well, there are other ways for a beautiful woman to work off a debt. I run several fine establishments in the territorial capital. Very exclusive. Gentlemen there pay a premium for quality. The threat, vile and explicit, hung in the sweltering air like the stench of a slaughterhouse. Silas felt the rage building in his chest, a hot, volcanic pressure. He wanted to draw his gun and end this right now, but he held it back. He had learned patience the hard way, in boardrooms and on cattle drives. One wrong move, and Clara would pay the price. He had to be smarter than his own anger. There's a third option, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Cross raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I pay whatever you claim Samuel owed, Silas stated, his eyes locked on Cross. Every last dollar. And Mrs. Bell walks away from here, free and clear. Cross threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, mirthless sound that echoed across the silent square. You still don't get it, do you? After all these years, you're still the same sentimental fool. He stopped laughing, and his face became a mask of cold fury. This was never about Samuel Bell's debt, he hissed. This was never even about Clara. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Silas could hear. This was always, always about you. The admission sent a shard of ice stabbing through Silas's veins. This was bigger, darker, more personal than he could have ever imagined. I've been watching you, Silas, Cross whispered, his eyes glittering with a 23-year-old hatred. I've followed your career with great interest. The Triple W Ranch, the biggest cattle operation in 3 territories, all built from nothing in just 20 years. Quite impressive for a man who walked away from a sure thing. Get to the point, Cross. The point, Cross snarled, his voice rising again for the whole town to hear, is that you left me holding the bag. 23 years ago, you walked out on our partnership. While you were off playing the honorable rancher, building your little empire, I had to adjust my methods. I had to get my hands dirty to achieve the goals we set together. And that adjustment, it cost me. It cost me everything. He was practically vibrating with a rage that had been simmering for over 2 decades. His men shifted, their hands hovering near their holsters. The air was thick with the promise of violence. So when I heard dear old Daddy Ward had finally kicked the bucket and left you his pathetic little plot of land here, and when I discovered that your precious Clara had married a fool who was deep in debt, well, it just seemed like Providence was finally smiling on me. A chance to settle all our old scores in one beautiful, poetic gesture. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of monstrous, patient revenge. You orchestrated this, Silas breathed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. All of it. Samuel Bell was a nobody freight hauler until I offered him more money than he'd ever seen to use his business as a cover, Cross boasted, his chest puffed out with pride. When he tried to get noble on me, killing him served 2 purposes. It eliminated a problem, and it gave me the perfect leverage over his beautiful, lonely widow. Clara let out a choked sob. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably. Each heaving breath she took seemed to cause her physical pain. Even in her terror, she was magnificent. This auction was the bait, Cross continued, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. I knew you'd have to come back to settle your father's estate. I knew you couldn't resist riding through town one last time. I knew you'd see her up there, and you'd remember everything you threw away. And I just knew that the sentimental, self-righteous fool you've always been would try to play the hero. He took another step, until they were almost chest to chest. The smell of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey rolled off him. And now you get to choose, Cross whispered, his scarred lip curling. Option 1, you get on your high horse and you ride away. You keep your fortune, you keep your reputation, you keep your life. And Mrs. Bell, she comes with me. His gaze flickered to Clara, a look of such possessive hunger that Silas felt his blood run cold. Or, Cross's hand moved slowly, deliberately to rest on the pearl handle of his gun. You try to play the hero, and you discover, right here, in front of everyone, that some debts can only be paid in blood. The choice was impossible, a devil's bargain. Silas looked over at Clara. He saw the resignation creeping into her eyes, extinguishing the last flicker of hope. She was already giving up. She was already sacrificing herself to save him, pulling away to protect him from the consequences of his own past. For 23 years, he had been haunted by a single question. What if? What if he had stayed? What if he had fought for her? Every lonely night, every empty victory, every meaningless business deal had been shadowed by her absence. He had built an empire of solitude. Now, standing in the dust of the town he'd abandoned, he had one last chance. One chance to make it right. But the price was everything. His fortune, his reputation, his entire life. He could preserve the empire he'd built and watch the only woman he'd ever loved disappear into a living nightmare. Or he could throw it all away for a love he'd abandoned 2 decades ago. He held Clara's gaze, trying to pour all the regret, all the longing, all the unspoken words of 23 years into that single look. And in that moment, a decision crystallized within him. A decision born of desperation and a love that had refused to die. He turned his eyes back to Cross. There's something you don't know, Nathaniel, Silas said, his voice eerily calm. There's something nobody knows about how I really built my empire. A flicker of confusion, then intrigued curiosity crossed Cross's face. He motioned for Silas to continue. You always wondered, didn't you? Silas said, his voice carrying across the silent square. You watched from afar and you wondered how I did it, how I acquired so much land, so quickly, how I always seemed to know exactly which railroad spur was coming, which river was going to be dammed, which land the government would need for a new military post, how I could outbid ranchers who had been established for 50 years. He saw Clara staring at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. Fear was beginning to mix with the terror in her eyes. Fear of him. The truth is, Silas announced, his voice ringing with the weight of a confession, I didn't walk away from our partnership completely clean all those years ago. When I left, I took something with me, something that belonged to both of us. What are you talking about, Ward? Cross demanded, his patience wearing thin. Silas reached slowly into the inner pocket of his tailored black coat. Cross's men tensed, their hands dropping to their guns. The crowd held its breath, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He withdrew a worn leather portfolio, tied with a string. The maps, Nathaniel, Silas said softly. I took the maps. Cross's face went blank for a second, and then his eyes widened in dawning comprehension. No? He breathed. Oh, yes, Silas confirmed. Your uncle, the esteemed senator, the one who was feeding you insider information, the detailed survey reports showing where the new railroad lines were really going to be built, the government contracts outlining where every new fort and trading post would be established for the next 20 years, information that was supposed to make us kings. He held up the portfolio. I took them all. A strangled sound escaped Cross's throat. His face, which had been smug and triumphant moments before, was now a mask of pure murderous rage. Those were worth a fortune, he seethed. They were worth my fortune, Silas corrected him grimly. Every acre I bought, every herd I acquired, every deal I made, it was all based on the information in these documents. Information that rightfully belonged to both of us. For 23 years, Nathaniel, I've been living high on your half of the partnership. Clara let out a small, sharp intake of breath. The sound was like a blade twisting in Silas's gut. He could feel her disillusionment like a physical force. The hero she thought had returned was a fraud. The successful, honorable man she had once loved had built his entire life on a foundation of theft. He had saved her from one monster only to reveal that he was another. "So here's my offer," Silas said, his voice gaining strength, his eyes never leaving Cross's enraged face. "A new deal, right here, right now." He let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. "I'll give you what I truly owe you. Not money for some fabricated debt, the real debt. The one I've owed you for 23 years. He took a deep breath. Half of everything I own. The Triple W Ranch, split right down the middle. Half my cattle, half the money in my bank accounts. Your rightful share of the partnership that I stole from you all those years ago. A fortune that will make you the richest man in this territory." Cross stared at him, his mind clearly racing, calculating the staggering sums involved. It was a prize beyond his wildest dreams, a victory more complete than simply taking Clara. It was restitution, it was humiliation, it was everything his bitter, vengeful heart desired. But Silas wasn't finished. "There are conditions," he said, his voice turning to ice. "Clara, Mrs. Bell, goes free, completely free. No debts, no obligations, no threats. She walks away from this platform a free woman, and you and your men will never come near her again. Ever." Cross's eyes narrowed, the greed warring with the hatred on his face. "And if I refuse," he whispered, "if I decide I want it all, your money and the woman?" Silas gave him a grim, humorless smile. It was the smile of a man with nothing left to lose. "Then I open this portfolio," he said quietly, his hand tightening on the leather, "and I burn these documents right here, in the middle of your town square." "You'd be destroying your own leverage," Cross scoffed. "You still don't understand what these are, do you?" Silas said. "You think they're just old maps." He pulled one of the documents partially from the portfolio. It was covered in annotations, dates, names, figures. "For the past 10 years, Nathaniel, I've used my influence, my contacts. I've been tracking you. These aren't just the senator's old survey reports anymore. They're my ledger. They show every illegal land grab you've ever made, every smuggling route you use for your merchandise, every official you've bribed, from here to the territorial capital." Silas's voice dropped to a near whisper, a venomous secret shared between them. "They even detail the convenient accidents that befell anyone who stood in your way. Like Samuel Bell." The color drained from Cross's face. "So you see," Silas continued, pressing his advantage, "if I burn these, I might lose a fortune. But you lose everything. You'll have federal marshals crawling all over you before the ashes are even cold. And I made copies, sent them to a lawyer in Cheyenne, with instructions to open them if I happen to have an accident of my own." It was a checkmate, a desperate, world-burning, mutually assured destruction. The silence that followed was absolute. The entire town of Willowbrook was frozen, watching the silent war being waged between two men who had once been brothers. Cross was a wolf caught in a steel trap, and he knew it. He was trapped between his all-consuming greed and his instinct for survival. Then Silas did something no one expected. He turned his gaze away from Cross and looked directly at Clara. His voice when he spoke was soft, gentle, meant only for her. "Clara," he said, the name a prayer on his lips. "When I was 17 years old, standing by the creek behind your father's house, I made you a promise. Do you remember what it was?" Tears, which she had held back for so long, finally began to spill from her emerald eyes, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak. "I promised," he said, his voice thick with 23 years of regret, "that I would never, ever let anyone hurt you. I broke that promise the day I rode out of this town. It is the single greatest failure of my life. He took a step closer to the platform. I am not breaking it again. That was when Cross's control finally snapped. You self-righteous bastard, he roared, his hand flying to his gun. You think you can just waltz in here and... I think, Silas interrupted, his voice like the crack of a whip, his own hand now a blur as it went for his own pistol, that you're going to take the deal. The standoff was electric, 2 guns drawn, an empire hanging in the balance. You're going to take the deal, Silas repeated, his voice dangerously low, because the alternative is that we both go down in flames. And in that chaos, Clara might get hurt anyway. This is the only way out for you. You get the justice you've craved for 2 decades. I get to keep my promise. And she gets to start over, free and clear. The negotiation hung in the air like a hangman's noose. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Silas could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. Finally, with a shudder of pure, impotent rage, Cross slowly, deliberately lowered his weapon. He nodded once, his jaw tight. Half, he bit out, half of everything, documented, witnessed, signed and sealed. Agreed, Silas said, holstering his own gun. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. It was over. He had won. But Cross's cold, cruel smile was returning. But I want one more thing, Cross added, his eyes glittering with a fresh wave of malice. A final bit of entertainment for my troubles. Silas waited, his body tense. I want her to choose, Cross said, pointing a finger at Clara. Right now, in front of everyone. He turned his gaze to her, his voice becoming syrupy and persuasive. Mrs. Bell, you have a decision to make. You can come with me. Silas keeps his entire fortune, his precious empire remains intact, and you and I, we can come to a very lucrative arrangement. No hard feelings. Then he gestured with his chin toward Silas. Or, you can choose him, the thief who built his life on a lie, the coward who abandoned you. And you can watch as he signs away half of everything he has ever worked for, all for a woman who wasn't worth fighting for 23 years ago. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper that everyone could hear. Let's see how much his precious love is really worth, shall we? Let's see if you're willing to be the woman who ruins him. Every eye in the square turned to Clara. She stood on that platform of humiliation, the setting sun catching in her hair, turning the silver strands to fire. Her faded blue dress seemed to glow. In that moment, she wasn't a victim. She was something ancient and powerful, a figure from a painting, beautiful, tragic, and impossibly, breathtakingly brave. She took a shaky breath. She looked at Cross, the man who had murdered her husband and tried to enslave her. Then she looked at Silas, the man who had broken her heart but had returned and offered to burn down his entire world to keep a long-dead promise. The silence was deafening. Silas's heart felt like it was going to explode. His entire life, everything he was, everything he could be, rested on her next words. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as clear and strong as a church bell on a Sunday morning. I choose, she said, her eyes locking onto Silas's. But then she did something that stunned everyone. She didn't step toward Silas. She didn't step toward Cross. She took a step forward to the very edge of the platform and addressed the entire town. Before I make my choice, she said, her voice gaining power, you all deserve to know the truth. Not his truth, she gestured to Cross, or his, she nodded at Silas, but mine. A murmur went through the crowd. Cross looked confused. Silas felt a fresh wave of ice in his veins. What was she doing? Nathaniel Cross is right about one thing, Clara continued, her gaze sweeping over the townspeople. My husband Samuel was involved in his criminal dealings. He was a weak man and he was a scared man, but he was not an evil one. Her eyes hardened as she looked back at Cross. What he failed to mention is why Samuel tried to back out. It wasn't because he suddenly found God. It was because I found out what he was doing. I gave him an ultimatum. He could continue to work for this monster, and I would leave him and expose them both. Or he could walk away, and we could start over, somewhere new. He chose to walk away. He chose us. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Nathaniel Cross didn't kill a traitor. He killed a man who was trying to become better. Then she turned her full attention to Silas. Her expression was a complex mix of emotions: pain, love, disappointment, and something else. Something he couldn't quite read. "And you, Silas," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You came back. You offered to sacrifice everything for me. You tried to be the hero I dreamed you were when I was a girl. But you built your life on a lie, a theft. You became a different kind of monster, didn't you? A respectable one in a finer suit, but a man who took what wasn't his all the same." Silas felt his face flush with shame. She was right. He had no defense. He had traded his honor for success, and now the bill had come due. "So you see," she said, looking back and forth between the two men, "I am being asked to choose between two thieves, one who steals lives and one who steals futures." Cross laughed, a short, ugly bark. "It doesn't matter what you call us, sweetheart. You still have to choose." "You're right," Clara said. "I do." She reached into the bodice of her worn dress, and her hand emerged not with a weapon, but with a small, leather-bound book. It was worn and frayed at the edges. "You see, Mr. Cross," she said, holding up the book, "when you had my husband killed, your men were careless. They searched his office, but they didn't search me. Samuel was scared. He knew you might turn on him, so he started keeping records." Cross's smile vanished. "This," Clara said, her voice ringing with triumph, "is his ledger. It's not about survey lines or potential profits, Silas. It's the truth. Every name, every date, every illegal shipment, every bribe paid to every official, including our own Sheriff Miller over there." She pointed a trembling finger at the town sheriff, who suddenly looked like he was about to be sick. "It even details the orders you gave for 3 other accidents over the last 5 years," she said, her eyes boring into Cross. "It's all in here, in his own hand." The power in the square shifted. It was a seismic event. It moved from Cross's guns, past Silas's fortune, and settled squarely into the hands of the woman in the faded blue dress, holding a cheap little book. Silas's maps were leverage. Her ledger was a death sentence. She held the book up high. "So this is my choice," she declared. "I don't choose the monster who destroyed my life, and I don't choose the man who built his on a lie." Silas's world tilted on its axis. He had lost. After everything, he had still lost. "I choose to be free," she said, and then she stepped down from the platform. She walked past Cross without a second glance. He was frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. She walked directly to Silas. She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her emerald eyes. She took his hand, her fingers cool and steady against his trembling ones. "I won't let you sacrifice everything for me, Silas," she whispered for his ears only. "But I won't go with him either, and I won't let you be a thief anymore." She turned back to face the utterly defeated Nathaniel Cross. "Here is the final deal," she announced, her voice filled with an authority she had earned with blood and tears. "You will accept Silas's offer. You will take half of his stolen fortune, because that is the justice you are owed. And in return for your signature on those documents, this ledger disappears. You will have your money, and Silas and I, we will have our freedom. You will leave this town and never, ever return." She looked at Silas. "And you," she said softly, "will start over. Honest this time, with a clean slate." It was a brilliant, impossible move. She wasn't just saving herself. She wasn't just saving him. She was redeeming them both. Cross, trapped, cornered, and utterly outplayed, had no choice. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, but he was bound by his own greed. He gave a single, jerking nod. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as the richest man in 3 territories and a broken freight hauler's widow brought a king to his knees. The papers were drawn up by the town's terrified lawyer and signed on the top of a barrel. Silas Ward, with a steady hand, signed away half of his life's work. Nathaniel Cross, his hands shaking with rage, signed his agreement to leave them be. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across Willowbrook, Silas and Clara walked away from the town square, hand in hand. Behind them lay an empire, cut in half but not destroyed. Behind them lay the ghosts of the past, finally laid to rest. Ahead of them lay nothing but uncertainty, and everything that mattered. As they reached his horse, he stopped and turned to her. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face in the twilight. "Losing so much." He reached out, his hands finding her waist, feeling the impossible warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress. He lifted her easily onto the saddle, his hands lingering there for a heart-stopping moment. "I regret a lot of things, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I regret 23 years of wondering what if, 23 years of waking up alone, 23 years of building something that felt hollow and meaningless because I had no one to share it with." He met her gaze. "But this? Today? Saving you? No. Us saving us. This is the first thing I've done in 23 years that I know I will never, ever regret." She leaned down from the saddle, her silver-streaked hair falling around her face like a veil. And she kissed him. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of their youth. It was slow and soft and sweet. It was a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and sorrow and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling. That same breathtaking smile that had captured his heart by a willow tree when they were barely more than children. "So," she whispered, her breath warm against his cheek, "what happens now?" "Now," he said, swinging up onto the horse behind her, his arms circling her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Now we go home." He settled in behind her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own. "We've got a ranch to run," he murmured into her ear. "It might be half the size it was this morning, but it's ours, truly ours, for the first time." He pulled her closer, a lifetime of loneliness melting away in the warmth of her presence. "And sometimes," he added, his voice barely a whisper against the rising night wind, "half of everything is more than enough when you're finally sharing it with the right person." They rode out of Willowbrook and into the sunset, leaving behind the auction block, the broken promises, and the men who dealt in secrets and lies. They rode toward a future they would have to build from the ground up, together. Sometimes the price of redemption is everything you thought you owned, and sometimes the most impossible choice is the only one that can truly set you free. If this story of secrets, sacrifice, and a love that refused to die kept you on the edge of your seat, we'd be truly grateful if you'd let us know by hitting that subscribe button. Every single subscription helps us bring more stories like this to you. And drop a comment below letting us know which twist shocked you the most. We love reading your reactions. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next story.